Hello and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 3, Advanced Certificate in Procurement and Supply Operation. This is Module 2, Ethical Procurement and Supply, Learning Outcome 1, which is to know the techniques that can achieve added value and its contribution to organisational success. So we're going to start by defining value for money. So let's start with the word value. What does value mean? It's the extent to which a product or service supplied to a customer meets their requirements. And that can be assessed by whether the customer is willing to pay for a product or service. And do remember, what's valuable to one customer isn't necessarily valuable to another. So have a think about how much you'd be willing to pay for a car. And would you be willing to pay more if it had extra features like air conditioning, sat-nav or reverse parking? Some people will be willing to pay more, some won't. And some wouldn't even buy the car in the first place because they don't need to. So that's basically how we define value for money. You know, it's very much a personal thing. It's what meets the needs of that particular customer, whether they're willing to pay for it. And value for money can be achieved through cost efficiency and effectiveness. So procurement used this total cost of ownership approach to determine value for money. So we look at things like not just the price of the purchase, but the cost for things like delivery and installation or training, labour, operational costs, maintenance, any sort of utility use, the health and safety training, and ultimately the disposal at the end. And we'll go through some of these things in a bit more detail. So we're going to start off with the purchase price or the costs itself. So this is going to be made up of a combination of direct and indirect costs. Which ones are fixed and which ones are variable? Well, as you can see from the slide on the screen, direct costs tend to be variable. These are kind of your materials that you'll use in, in producing a product or a service to sell to the customer. So they tend to vary by output. Whereas your indirects tend to be fixed. These are things that you need to absorb regardless of the quantities you sell. So direct supplies are usually used to produce something to sell to a customer. So if you were selling books, it would be the paper that you need and the printing to go into making that book. So you'll have quantities that are tied to the bill of materials or the master production schedule. So for example, if you're making 1,000 books, you'll need so many reams of paper, etc. The requirements can be specific, can be costed individually and assigned to the project or item that you're selling, which is easy to measure and control. Indirects, though, are bought to keep the organisation running. So these are kind of overheads, general running costs. The quantities or provisions required during a project might be determined by price, availability, storage, working space, skills, and so on. There's a greater opportunity for widening the scope according to what's available, as well as outsourcing or merchandising. Items can be costed and assigned individually, like a proportion of a programmer's time or something that's quantified as an overhead. And it can be difficult to measure and control due to the number of variables. So KPIs or key performance indicators are used extensively with indirects. So added value is the amount of money an organisation adds on after the costs, which can come from those fixed, variable, direct or indirect. And all of these things will contribute towards profit. So the profit and added value can be increased if we reduce the input costs by lowering the costs that we pay to our suppliers. But we could also look at adding features to the product or service, like those reversing cameras on a car, or maybe providing free insurance. The camera being something tangible that you can physically see and touch, whereas the insurance is intangible. You can't physically see and touch it. You can add value by providing excellent service, giving attention to detail, being polite, patient and willing to help. But you can also get this through your brand reputation and loyalty. And that can also help with word of mouth experience. But some people feel like convenience is an added value, such as, you know, maybe paying a slightly higher price for a pint of milk that you can get at the local corner shop versus a cheaper price for travelling to a larger one. So I said we'd come back to those total costs from the first slide, and I'm just going to go down to some of them and look at them in a little bit more detail. So let's go with the product and service price first. Logically, the lower the price, the better the deal, but you can't look at that in isolation. If you're buying from overseas, you may need to consider the exchange rates because they can fluctuate over time, which means that a price you achieve today might not remain that way. Then the freight cost, which again more important with overseas transactions because you need to understand whether that's included. If it's not, how much is it going to cost you? And does then that make that deal competitive? You've got the packaging costs. Packaging preferably should be returnable, recyclable. But if it's single use, you're going to have a cost to manage the waste at the other end. Maintenance, I mean, it's obviously preferable for it to be included in the price, but if it isn't, then what's it going to cost you to maintain it? And a warranty is something that can add value because it's a promise to repair or replace your item within an agreed period of time. Also look at a supplier's reputation because a bad reputation can reflect negatively on your organisation. So work with suppliers that have a good reputation. The order quantities and inventories, essentially they need to meet demand and not be exceeding that, because if for example you've got a really good price but the supplier is asking you to take large quantities like a pallet worth and that's way too much for your needs, then it's not really getting value for money because you might end up throwing half of that in the bin. Packaging's come up again. We've got payment terms. Payment terms, the longer the terms, the shorter you're having issues with your cash flow. So obviously payment terms need to be right. I mean, if they're asking you for advance payment or anything too short, then it may cause you a cash flow problem. Quality needs to be appropriate and fit for purpose. So it doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be the best quality, but it certainly needs to meet the needs of the customer. And do think about those environmental factors as well, because bad practices could result in products being rejected by your customer. We're now going to look at the 5 rights of procurement. So the 5 rights that we're trying to address is to find the right product, but it needs to be of the right quality, in the right quantity, at the right price, going to the right place at the right time. And it says to and from the right place because it's as much about finding the right supplier to get it from as it is ensuring that it gets to the right address. So let's go through them one by one. Let's look at quantity first. Too little could result in production line stopping, but too much could increase your storage costs. From a quality point of view, inferior quality could halt production, whereas superior quality would increase your cost unnecessarily. Time, products and services need to be delivered when the organisation needs them and is expecting them and is open to receive them. So being too early or too late are both as bad as one another. In terms of the place, supplies need to be obtained from the right supplier and delivered to the right place. So to get it to the right place, you may have to be a bit more helpful in terms of the location. Don't just provide an address, but you might need a named contact, whether to go to the front of the building, the back of the building, and you may even have specific requirements like loading bays where certain vehicles are needed in order to load and offload easily. And then price, as we said before, you know, it's good to have a competitive price, but you mustn't prioritize these above all other factors. Ultimately, an error in any of these rights could result in increased costs for your organisation somewhere down the line. Which then links to lifetime costing. This is something you would use primarily for assets, not just in general, but I guess with assets, you know, you're going to keep them for a long period of time and they don't come for free. You know, it's not just the purchase price you need to consider. You need to take into account all the anticipated costs for designing, procuring, acquiring, running, and disposing of that asset during its lifetime. And if we're talking about assets, just to sort of clarify what we mean by that, a fixed asset is something that's owned by your organisation and you use it to generate income such as property, machinery or land or vehicles. And you can give an organisation a long-term view of how much this investment is going to cost you over a period of time. So if for example, we're buying vehicles to deliver goods to our customers, It may be that our view is to keep that vehicle for 5 years. So you do your lifetime costing over the 5 years. So to calculate it, you look at your pre-purchase costs, like doing research, your item cost, not just the product or service price, but also the freight, transportation, packaging, and payment terms. Then you look at the acquisition costs and the pre-purchase costs together. So you'd include the operating costs, such as things like power consumption, operator manpower, and training. The maintenance costs will include for repairs and services, including parts and labour. Insurance costs, and finally disposal costs. What's it going to cost you to get rid of it? But it's not always true that at the end of a particular life, a product is worth nothing. You know, it can either be partially depreciated in terms of value or fully depreciated. If it's fully depreciated, you're going to have to pay to dispose of it. If it's partially depreciated, it's worth something to someone, which is often what you do with a vehicle. You sell it and get some money back, and that's known as residual income. You can apply this to services as well, but it's most commonly used for assets. So what's the advantages and disadvantages of using lifetime costing? Well, the good thing is that it does improve your awareness as an organisation, which means that you understand the costs and how many sales you need to make to break even and get a return on that investment, which will then, of course, enable you to take action. If break even is going to take too long, then maybe you might change your selling price. It will definitely help you to make clear decisions that are backed up by facts, evidence-based decisions, as I call them, and also help you to forecast, because you understand how much you're going to have in your budget. Like, for example, if you were buying a car in your own personal life, you're going to have to think about the cost of running it. So what's the fuel consumption like? What's the insurance cost? And what's the service costs on an annual basis, and budget for that on a monthly basis? And that's basically what businesses will do as a result of that. But the downside is that you end up with pressure from management because they push harder when they know a little bit too much, which could make you a bit reactive because you're waiting for lifetime cost feedback instead of live data. It is time consuming. It takes quite a long time to complete this, and it's based on a lot of assumptions. And costs can change, which means that you're constantly having to update this. So moving on to organisational success, the factors that contribute to making an organisation successful are on the slide. So we're going to start with the people. You need obviously people to serve your customers, but ideally these people need to be motivated, driven, empowered, and professionally trained. They need a purpose. So why do they exist? And it's to serve a particular customer, a particular product or service, but it's the reason your organisation exists, and it's often captured very easily in your mission statement. Procedures help the people, again, I guess, because it's a set of tasks that need to be carried out to meet your organisation's objectives. So you understand what you need to do. You need customers. These are people who have a need and are willing to pay for the products. And finally, resources, which includes people, tools, physical location to work in, and money to pay your staff and suppliers. But even when you've got all 5 of these factors, it doesn't actually guarantee success. The factors have to be managed correctly. This has come up in previous lectures, but in case you're just watching this particular one, I'm just going to introduce you to the 3 E's concept, which stands for efficiency, economies of scale, and effectiveness. And this is, again, a way that you can try to deliver value for money. But let's talk about the differences in these words. So let's start with efficiency. Efficiency is about saving time. Okay, so a person or an organisation's ability to perform a task competently with the least amount of waste in the shortest amount of time. And the Kaizen 5S framework can help with this, which is on the next slide. All of these things can be used to improve efficiency, and lean thinking can also be used to eliminate the 7 types of waste that Tim would. Economies is about saving money, not time. So it's achieved when the quantities of a product or service is increased and the price per unit decreases. In theory, the more of a product you buy, the lower the price should be. And an organisation may need to change suppliers in order to reduce cost through economies of scale or consolidate their supply base. Efficiency and effectiveness should never come at the cost of quality. And finally, effectiveness. This is an individual or organisation's capability to carry out a task and solve the associated problem. Now, most organisations measure success against profit. How much did they make? And how did it compare with what they projected? But it can be measured in targets like volumes of products manufactured. It can be looking at things like market share, sales per month, and so on and so forth. So the 5S framework, this is used to refine methods and procedures within an organisation that turn efficiency. It was originally compiled from Japanese words, but these have been translated into English for the use in businesses worldwide. So I kind of like to refer to a messy warehouse versus a very well laid out warehouse where you can find things really easily as a way to explain how this works. So imagine a really messy warehouse. If you were asked to go and find a particular box of a product, it would take you quite a long time to find it because you have no idea where it is. The 5S framework will help you. So firstly, sort things out, tidy up the stock, remove things that are no longer needed. Then set them in order and put things away and set up a system that means you can find things quickly. Like, I don't know, pink ones are over here, blue ones are over there. Or even put it in alphabetical order if that's easier. The shine bit is looking at inspecting the items that are on the shelf to find any defects and basically getting rid of them. Standardize is to create a process that's going to be followed by anybody thereafter so they can put things away and keep to the standards that you've set. And then sustain it. To embed this as your daily routine, it should become a habit and good practice. Lean. Kaizen led the concept of lean thinking. Lean is about removing fat, whether that be from a product or a process. And it's based on identifying the 7 types of waste that hinder the success of a project or a business. And I like to remember this using the name Tim Wood, TIMWOOD. The TIM is transportation, inventory, and motion. So transportation is basically the unnecessary movement of products using vehicles. Inventory is holding more inventory than you can physically sell. And motion would be, that messy warehouse example, moving things around so you're not, being very efficient. It could even be where your printer is. If somebody has to walk for 10 minutes to print something off, it's a waste of motion. For the wood, we've got waiting, overproduction, overprocesses, and defects. Waiting is a waste of time, clearly. So if you can, try and streamline your processes. Overproduction is producing more than you can physically sell, so try not to do that because it will ultimately end up with additional inventory. Overprocessing is essentially doing something to the product that the customer doesn't value, or writing reports that nobody ever reads. And finally, defects, which looks at items that have been rejected by the customer. They'll either end up in the bin or you'll waste time reworking those items. Value engineering and value analysis are next. So value engineering and value analysis are pretty much the same. It's more about where it happens in the process. So they both look at the ratio between function and cost. Value engineering takes place at the design stage or at the introductory stage, right before the product's ever launched onto the market. And it aims to enhance functionality and reduce cost before it's launched. So procurement's job in this particular type of example is to focus on finding best value for money at this stage. Value analysis actually is very similar to value engineering, but the difference is it relates to existing products that are already on the market. So they're probably in maturity or decline, somewhere along those lines. So what you would do is use this when costs need to be removed from a product that's already established. So you can reduce the price and perhaps prolong the maturity of that product to prevent it from completely falling off the radar. So moving on to quality as part of our 5 rights. Quality can be defined as something that's good, bad, or indifferent, a standard to something you compare against other things that are similar. It can be related to people's opinions and tastes, and it doesn't have to be the best, it just has to be fit for purpose. So within procurement, we can approach quality by looking at these areas on the screen. So performance is the first one. We ask ourselves, does it perform to an acceptable standard? For the features, what does it have that makes it acceptable? So if you take that car example, would you say a car that doesn't have electric windows is not an acceptable quality nowadays? Think about reliability. Does it break or stop working? And in terms of conformance, does it require any standards or legislation like CE marks on toys or something like that? Durability, is it tough enough and will it last? If you think about Duracell batteries, they really did capture what we mean by something that's going to last long enough. Serviceability, how effectively can it be serviced? So if something goes wrong, is it easy and is it easy to get access to that service? Aesthetics is how we judge things with our eyes. So we look at whether it's attractive and whether it fits in with the trend. And finally, perceived quality. Does it meet the quality the buyer expects? You often get this with prestige type things like Ferraris and stuff like that. Now, David Garvin produced a theory based on the 5 approaches to defining quality. He said that, quality can be transcendental, which is where people cannot logically or quantifiably define it, but they know it when they see it. So I think the example that CIPS provide for this is someone that perhaps buys mascara or a beauty product, and the company claims that using this product will give you beautiful eyes. Product-based ones is better to use because it's more quantifiable. You can measure it from the dimensions we looked at on the previous slide, which is things like durability, reliability. The user-based one comes down to somebody's personal preference and perceived ideas. Manufacturing is easier as well because it looks at specifications. So if you're manufacturing cakes or something, it will look at what was it meant to look like, what was the color meant to be, what was the aroma. And you can basically check whether it's acceptable or not. And the value-based one is where the consumer assesses the cost against the offer. And I guess this is quite subjective because it depends on what's important to that particular customer. So I often use the example of a flight. So you could have 2 flight options to go from, let's say, London to Cape Town. One might do a direct flight that will cost you £1,000 return, and it will take, let's say, 12 hours. Or another airline might offer you half the price, but it's going to take you an additional 6 hours because you have to stop over in Istanbul, for example. Now, this value-based one, the customer will say, what do I value more, my time or my money? Some will go for the more expensive one because their time is more important, whereas others will take the longer one because it's a cheaper price. Now, quality standards exist in order for organisations to produce and supply goods that are of an acceptable quality. Standards, processes and procedures also are aiming towards achieving good quality standards collectively from what we know as a quality management system, or a QMS. Now, the International Organisation for Standardisation, or ISO as you might know them, promotes quality in both manufacturing and service organisations using an accreditation known as ISO 9001. This is a global standard for quality that's recognised worldwide. The standard is based on continuous improvement, risk management, leadership processes, supply chain and efficiency. Within it, you're going to have an element of quality assurance and quality control. They work together. Now, quality assurance is a set of planned activities that check to ensure that products or services fulfill the quality requirements. So your quality assurance strategy should be designed and agreed at the very start of a project in order to try and prevent defects from occurring. This is about getting it right first time. It involves regular and constant inspections of your product or service. Whereas quality control is concerned with correcting defects after it, so it's a detection method. And you do need to do both. You can't just rely on one and not the other. But if you invest more in your quality assurance, preventing defects, you will spend less controlling and detecting as well as correcting those defects. Now, there was another author called Crosby that outlined some absolutes of quality. He said that quality means conformance, not goodness or elegance. And there is no such thing as a quality problem or the economics of quality, because it's always easier to get the job right and on time. The only performance measurement is the cost of quality, and the only performance standard is zero defects. So he developed this concept of zero defects, which is where organisations essentially endeavour to produce products that can't be faulted. And it forms part of the Six Sigma process, which you can see on the screen. The steps you go through with Six Sigma is to define, measure, analyse, improve and control. And it's called Six Sigma because it aims to move towards 6 deviations between the mean and the nearest specification limit. And I think it allows for 3.4 defects per million. But if you're aiming for something to be, let's say, 100 grams, you might say that 97 grams is okay, or 103 grams is okay, because you're 3 standard deviations above and below the 100 gram mark. If it falls within there, then it's accepted to be a zero defect, but it falls outside of that, then it would be a defect. Now, the concept of zero defects has many advantages, but also some potential disadvantages. So, for example, the advantages is that it will reduce waste and cost, ultimately leading to customer satisfaction and loyalty, which in turn will lead to better sales and profitability. And staff actually want to work for a company that's doing things well. The downside is that sometimes you're striving for the impossible, which can demotivate employees. So I think the managers really need to clearly lead by example and not expect 100% of the time, because it's not realistic. Performance reduces due to low morale, and zero defects is open to interpretation. The quality circle is a concept that relates to continuous improvement, and it aims to help do things better and more efficiently to result in better quality being produced. So you can see on the screen this plan, do, check, act approach that came from an author called Deming, developed after one of the world wars, I believe. But the planning phase is where you're looking at what do we mean by quality, what are we trying to achieve. The do phase is your quality assurance. This is about preventing defects. The control phase, or the check phase, looks at quality control, which is essentially checking whether you've done it right, detecting defects. And then finally, if you do notice that you've got a problem, you need to act upon it and do some quality improvement work, then go back round, plan it, assure it, control it, and so on and so forth. So it's a never-ending cycle of activity. Moving on to lead times and expediting. So lead time refers to the amount of time that it's required to obtain an item. And we often think about the external lead time, which is the point from when we place an order with a supplier to the time it's delivered. So it could be like, I don't know, 7 days or something like that. But we also have an internal lead time as well, which is the time it takes for us to respond to a requisition from a colleague and create an order. And there are some, hard and fast rules about that. Clearly, if you've got a contract in place, it's very quick. But if you don't, you might have to spend some time getting quotes from suppliers to determine who's the right supplier. But your internal lead time will depend on your system as well, whether you're working on an automated or a manual system, the efficiency of your workforce and how quick they work, the information that we hold already on our supplier database, and attention to detail. But the external lead time could be affected by suppliers' capacity, raw material availability, and again, their own organisational efficiency. But it could also matter impact from sort of contractual terms as well. Sometimes if you've got a term contract, you get better response than a spot contract. The mode of transport you choose, clearly air freight's quicker than sea freight, and any force majeure event where we've got things that are up beyond anybody's control, like a hurricane or a flood, which would potentially impact your supply chain. If you add those two things together, that gives you your total lead time. So how do we check that we're hitting the right time? You can see on the screen a Gantt chart, which was devised by a man called Henry Gantt many years ago. Quite easy to read, really, when you've got all the tasks or things that need to be done on the left-hand side, and when they need to be done by across the top. And each of those kind of blue squares you can see is a milestone, an activity or a discrete task that has a deadline, and it helps to move the project forward. Milestones are commonly used in larger projects, and it helps us quite visually to monitor the deadlines and ensure that they're met. So at the beginning of week 2, for example, we'd be sitting there going, right, we need to expedite the orders for components on this particular one to make sure that we hit it on time. Now, expediting, just leading on to that, is the process where procurement track the progress of an order. Now, we can do that all the time if we want to, or we can do it by exception, depending on how important that is to you. But it's essentially a process of an order that we send to a supplier. We're looking for an acknowledgement, and we check that it's gone through manufacture and the shipment's been made. And scheduling can help us to understand all of our organisational needs and plan accordingly to make sure that we always deliver on time. I always think it's good to work backwards, look at when it needs to be done by. If that's week 8, week 9, then we can work backwards and make sure we hit the deadline. Now, inventory is the cost of stock held by an organisation that's not needed at the current time. So all organisations have some kind of inventory, but the ideal is to keep it as low as possible due to the associated costs. Two methods that can be used to monitor inventory and reduce them is just-in-time and Kanban. You're seeing Kanban on the screen right now. But just-in-time is exactly, it does what it says on the tin. It's a system that works alongside Lean in order to reduce waste in the supply chain. So it makes sure that stock is not held unnecessarily, reducing inventory, and stock arrives just in time. But Kanban works on a 2-bin system where you'll have 2 bins with products in them. When bin 1 is empty, bin 2 gets pulled forward, and then you trigger a replenishment order. Kanban is Japanese, I think, for billboard or signpost or something like that. And the final slide in this revision session is to look at evaluating suppliers' performance. So it's a measure to ensure that the supplier has delivered what they promised. And it captures actually these 5 rights. You've got things like quality, cost, time, quantity, making sure that the supplier has delivered upon what they agreed. The supplier achievement against them can be monitored to make sure that we provide feedback, and it's important that KPIs are measurable, smart, etc., and that we can monitor them. I mean, the results generated can be presented as a supplier scorecard, which is what you can see on the screen. That gives an overview of the performance and helps to identify areas of improvement. Serious failings could give you a justifiable reason to terminate the contract. And the example you can see on the screen gives a higher weighting to quality and time. But actually, it's the 2 areas that they're failing on, or not, certainly not performing as well on. They're doing really well on the location and cost, but time and quality is more important. So what this essentially does is it weights the score, meaning that it drags it down to 92% because even though they've scored 100 on some of the other ones, they're not as important. And it's given a sort of red, amber, green approach on this one. And actually what this is showing you is the supply's not doing very well at all, because we've had 5 consecutive reds from February to June. And the average score is 90.64, which if you look at the scorecard indicator, that's a sort of an amber, I guess. We really ideally need them to be in the green, and they've only achieved that once. So it helps you to have a sort of informed conversation with the supplier about what they're not doing very well and what they could perhaps improve on in the following month. But I hope that's been helpful revision for you. That's the end of this session. So thank you for watching.